with us today. Laura Faye is a research scientist and program manager for the Winter Maintenance and Effects Research Group at the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. She is also the associate director for the Center for Sustainable Transportation in Cold Climates, University Transportation Center, a consortium of 3 universities that include Montana State University, Washington State University, and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. In addition to serving on several national boards and committees on the topic, Laura has over a decade of transportation-related research experience and a demonstrated publication record in the areas of winter maintenance operations and environmental issues related to maintenance operations and materials and low-volume roads. And she received her Master's in Science and Environmental Science and Health from the University of Nevada, Reno. And Laura will be presenting on best management practices and national perspective. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, wow. I have a very quiet voice, so if you can't hear me in the back, give me a thumbs up, and I will do my best. I feel very space age right now. So thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited. I've not been to this part of New York before, and I love seeing the country. I am from Montana, and if anybody wants to talk about Montana, everybody seems to really like the state. I'm happy to chat about it. But really, you know, we're here all talking about the same stuff, and I don't want to repeat myself or repeat what other people are saying too much, but there is some validity to reinforcing points of best practices. Just to kind of show you the perspective from Montana, the bottom picture in the middle is in Bozeman, Montana, which is where the university is. It's a liquid tank on a truck. You can see they've got stream nozzles. They're applying a liquid to the road. You can see the Bridger Range in the background. It's beautiful, just like it is here, and we have a lot of winter weather. In the context of environmental impacts, we have very important waterways in Montana, just like you do. And we also have people that like to fish and to hunt, and there's a sense of environmental stewardship that goes along with that that may not fit with the traditional kind of redneck theme that a lot of people think of when they think of rural areas. So know that you're not isolated in the fact that you care what goes into the environment. The middle photo up there is from Washington. It's along a major highway, and you can see the browning of the trees, and that's from snow being cast off the road that has de-icer in it. And that's an issue that Washington State has had to deal with, and I'm sure you've seen it. We've seen it kind of all over the country, and it's a real issue. The photo on your far right, those are mountain sheep, and they are on a highway in Montana, and animals like to come to the road, and they like to eat salt off of it. And it's dangerous for many reasons. It can be dangerous for the animals, but it can also be dangerous for the people driving cars that hit them. So it's more than just salt getting into the water. It's an ecosystem issue, and I'm really glad to see that we're all talking about it. So I'm supposed to provide a national perspective, so I'm going to do the best I can, but I'm also going to try and cover information that maybe hasn't been covered yet. So just to set the stage, I just Googled chloride accumulation in waterways, and this article popped up from the Washington Post. So know that you're not isolated in this issue of chloride loading and accumulation over time, and that's in the recent news. But this is actually a decade-old document. It's a pamphlet put together by Massachusetts DOT from wells that were contaminated from de-icers. So this is not a new issue either. It's been going on for a long time. Okay, so I'm going to use my slides a little more now. I wanted to highlight kind of the current direction of where things are going from my perspective. I don't know if everyone would agree with me on these, but I think there's a huge trend in a lot of the DOTs and with the local counties to, as you need to invest in new trucks, upgrading those vehicles with new technology. And you heard a lot about the blades, and I'll talk more about some other technology that you can put on the vehicles. But at this point in time, to really optimize what we're putting out there, you really do need to invest in this newer technology. And the next point ties into that really nicely, in that everybody is working with less money now. It's just the way things are working right now, and it's really unfortunate. But one thing that we've found and one way that we sell environmental stewardship is oftentimes if you can justify investing in new technology, the cost savings you get from that equals less product put in the environment. So we heard the DOT talking about using anti-icing and how it's putting less product in the environment, but you do have to upgrade and invest in that technology to see those benefits. Other things that are really worrying some parts of the country right now are the enforcement of TMDLs. Chicago, I was just there a few months ago. It's a huge concern, and they're kind of on the cusp of enforcement at this point in time. New Hampshire also has TMDL issues with chloride, and so how are they navigating this new world of chloride enforcement, which is kind of the next level? You guys are just saying, hey, we're seeing chloride in the water, we should start paying attention. You don't want to get to the point where someone is actually enforcing because you have a severe issue. The last talk and a question came up about weather and pavement data and forecasts. I'll get into that a little bit, but the more data you have to make your decisions, the better decision you're going to make. And finally, kind of new products or alternative to chloride products is something I'll talk about for a while. Specifically, folks are really hot on the topic of ag-based and bio-based products, and I'll discuss those a little bit. So just to provide some perspective on the different products, can I get a raise of hands of people that are not winter maintenance professionals? Okay. So I'm going to take a step back and do some basic explanation of the different de-icers and how and why and when they might be applied. So we've talked about sand. Treated sand is usually sand blended with rock salt at about, 10% is what they do in Montana. You can also treat sand with a liquid product. Chlorides, here when they talk about rock salt or salt brine, that is sodium chloride. And that can be mined, or that can be solar salt that you see out kind of in the ponds, in the bay, and in the ocean. Mag chloride and calcium chloride usually come in a flake or a pellet form as a solid, and you can make those into a liquid as well. Just from a chemistry perspective, there's a 2 for the chlorides with magnesium and calcium. So if you put down the exact same amount of sodium chloride as you do magnesium chloride, you're going to have twice the number of chlorides in the water from the magnesium chloride. It's something to think about as we're talking about these other products. Ag-based products or bio-based products, these are usually co-products from an existing practice or industry. So when they make vodka, they have potato waste, and they can use that. And so it's considered a green application of using waste products to incorporate these. And the final group, acetates, formates, and glycols. These are de-icers. They work well. They're used at airports daily. They're great because they have low corrosion rates. And I'll get into, we'll talk about it later. Liquids, just really quick, I'll explain the pictures. This is called like a tank farm. This was a liquid storage unit, just in case you have never seen one before. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, so I'm just going to talk, and you can kind of read the slide as you want. But there's a lot of information that's really important on this slide. And the first part that we'll start at is the temperature ranges that are listed with each product. So sand can be applied whenever. In Montana, we use it when it's really, really, really cold. When nothing else is going to work, we'll put some sand down just to provide some traction where it's icy. Sodium chloride, we typically say, and you've heard it from multiple speakers today, it works well down to about 15 degrees. There's probably people out here that are saying, I put it down colder than 15 and it worked, and you're 100% right, it will. But how well it works decreases significantly below 15 degrees. So if you want to use salt below 15 degrees, you're going to have to put a lot more product on the road to get that same effect. And so then you jump down to mag chloride and calcium chloride. And these are chloride-based products that work at colder temperatures. So when you hear about a cold temperature modified product, this is usually something that's in it. It's probably blended with mag or calcium, or it's solely mag or calcium. Next, we're going to look at solid versus liquid versus pre-wetting. When we're talking about solid material, that's like rock salt, and we call that, typically when it's applied, it's called de-icing. And de-icing is when you go out after the storm has started or after the snow and ice is already on the ground, and you apply the solid material on top of it. Application rates, the range can be huge. Usually people try to cap it at about 250 pounds per lane mile. So that's 1 pound per lane mile versus, and it increases as the application rate increases. You jump down to liquids. So this would be like your salt brine. And this is typically applied as an anti-icer. And you were kind of shown how it's done, where you go out before the storm, you put the liquid down, and then when the snow and ice hits the road, the bond between the snow and ice and the pavement does not form, or it's very weak. So it's really easy to plow that material off the road. And what's important here is the difference in application rates. Even on the low end, for a solid, you're applying 100 pounds per lane mile, versus your liquid rate at the low end, 10 gallons per lane mile. So just in the application method alone, you're using significantly less product. And so for folks that are interested and willing to try anti-icing, we're strongly encouraging it. Pre-wetting is something I'm going to get into. You saw some slides of the slurry spreader, the pug mill auger, and that's one method of pre-wetting, but basically you're adding a liquid to a solid. So you could be adding salt brine to sand, or salt brine to rock salt, or magnesium chloride to rock salt, or beet juice to rock salt. Any solid and liquid blend is pre-wetting. Okay, so this is where the overlap happens. But as we talk about de-icers, it's really important to talk about salt smart principles. And this concept is not new. It's been around for a long time, and people have called it many different things. The 3 R's, which is application in the right place, at the right time, and the right amount. So really or the triple bottom line is what other people call it. It's really balancing how much product we're putting out there for the right conditions. So if you know it's too cold to use salt, then don't use salt. And it's hard to have more than one product on hand all the time, but you may be able to justify, say, getting a tank of mag chloride to use in those conditions because of the additional amount of rock salt you'd have to put down in that colder weather. Okay, so getting into the best practices per se. Anti-icing has been talked about a lot today. It's basically just the liquid application. Again, you can see the liquid application truck in the picture. You've also seen a different type of application. There's a spray versus a stream. A lot of the people I've spoke to prefer the stream. They feel like it gets a good amount of product in a nice channel that can kind of stay there, but some people prefer the spray as well. A lot of research has been done on the effectiveness of anti-icing. It improves your level of service, which is how you manage and take care of the road. It's been shown to improve mobility and improve safety. There have been a few issues that people have had that they've had to work through, but generally speaking, once you try it and you kind of work through the kinks, a lot of folks are just moving towards anti-icing. It doesn't need to be this fancy on your truck. You can have a much smaller tank, and you can essentially build your own application nozzles in-house. There's a lot of folks that did that initially before a lot of this technology was developed. The benefits of anti-icing, well, you saw those differences in application rates from liquid to solid. You're saving money. You're using less product. You don't really need to use as many abrasives, and it really eases plowing. So that's less wear and tear on the vehicles, and it's less man hours, since it's usually guys driving the plows, out there in the field. And For me, a lot of times, I give this environmental talk quite a bit, but I don't give it in the context of let's be environmental stewards. I give it in the context of let's save you some money, and in the process, put less product out on the road. All right, moving on to pre-wetting. So I mentioned it earlier. Here's a picture of what it can look like. Oh, sorry, whoops, boop, boop. Okay, so here you've got your spray nozzle, and you can see it shooting a liquid onto the rock salt, and then it's hitting the spreader, and it's casting it out onto the road. That's one version of what pre-wetting might look like. And again, those pre-wet rates were super low, like I think it was 8 to 20 gallons per ton, it should have been. But with the slurry spreader, you're doing a much higher application rate, but you're seeing kind of more benefits from the additional liquid added to it. So pre-wetting is great. There's a ton of technology that's out there that you can buy, package, ready to go, so you can do it. By adding liquid to the solid product, for the folks that are driving the trucks and that are moving the product, it makes it a lot easier because that liquid helps break up any chunks, and it helps it stick where you put it on the road. That liquid helps it kind of stay in place, and it helps it activate quicker because the brine doesn't have to generate itself. There's already a little liquid to help activate it. There was a great study done in Michigan, and it was actually at a DOT shed. The guys were out there, they cleaned the pavement, they took their truck, and they put solid de-icer in it, and they drove at different rates, and they applied the same amount of material across the pavement at these different speeds, and then they went afterwards and they collected all the material off the road to see what stayed on the road. And what they found is that at a normal operating speed, you immediately lose 25% off of your lane from bounce and scatter. So that's a quarter of your product, just immediately gone. But if you pre-wet, that goes down to almost zero loss. So that alone, that quarter of the material you're applying, that justifies the investment in this technology. And you can do that calculation very easily, and if you want help, I'm happy to help you with it. But there are a lot of examples, like Paul Brown from Massachusetts, on his own, at his desk, just on a piece of paper, he wrote out what this would save his agency, and he took that number, and he was able to justify getting new, better equipment using those numbers. Okay, so getting back kind of to the environmental side of things. Here's just a diagram of all the different ways and places that these de-icers can end up. So you put it on the road, it can go up in the air, or it can kind of run off into the near-road environment. It can stay in the air depending on what it is. It can get cast off into the terrestrial system, so onto plants and soil. It can end up in the water, and it can impact aquatic and terrestrial species, and it can also impact soil. So we're going to quickly dive into this. So I apologize if you've seen this talk before. I haven't changed this slide in a long time. I like how it's circular. So we start here. You know, we're at the shed. Here's our solid material. We're loading it up. Here's our solid truck with our spreader. Here's our liquid truck. You put it down. It gets plowed off. I love this picture because you see that full spray that you get from the truck as it's driving by, casting that snow off the road into the near road environment. That is what causes this tree browning, this leaf singe. Occasionally it can kill a tree, but it's less common. Usually what happens is just the side of the tree facing the road turns brown, and it's just not very pretty. And this is that example in Washington State on the state highway pass. They ended up choosing to take back the right-of-way, and they ended up cutting down quite a few trees just to avoid the unsightly brown side of the trees. The salt can stay on the road, and it can get consumed and become a liability. There's a lot of data on the cost of wildlife vehicle collisions, and a lot of that cost comes from loss of human life. So it's an issue, and I think you guys have a lot of deer up here. We have a lot of deer too, but we also have a lot of big animals. Sometimes you hit a bear, which is kind of crazy. And then it can end up in the waterway. And I'm going to let the aquatic experts delve into that realm. Sand came up. So quite a few years ago, folks decided to move away from sand. And I'm going to explain why. So never mind that that's actually rock salt. Let's pretend he's putting sand in there. This is usually what it looks like when you sand the road. Notice that they're sanding on a fully snow-covered road. They're just trying to improve friction on the road. This is what happens when cars drive on the sand and they break it down and it gets cast up into the atmosphere. If you are in a place that gets inversions, the Flathead Valley where I live, we get really bad inversions. Denver Metro, really bad inversions. This isn't actually Denver Metro, this is Salt Lake City, but it shows the picture well. Denver Metro used to use a lot of sand. They became a EPA air quality non-attainment zone because of it, and they immediately had to stop using sand and switch to other practices. So if air quality is an issue, you may want to look at the type of sand you're using and how much you're using. It's not going to solve all your problems by switching to sand, as was mentioned earlier. Additionally, it can end up in your water bodies, and depending on the gradation of your sand, it can migrate perfectly into the riffles if you're a fisherman. The riffles are where the fish spawn, and it can clog up the pores and make it hard for those eggs to get oxygen. So really, there's no silver bullet. You have to really weigh what's a reasonable impact and versus human safety and mobility. The final piece of using sand is the cost of cleanup. Most places that use sand have a rule that they need to go back after a certain amount of time and clean it up. And that may be right after the storm, or that may be in the spring. But if you fold in the cost of cleaning up and either reusing or disposing of that sand into the initial cost of purchasing it, it's as expensive as de-icers. So it's something you really need to think about if you're just looking at sand from a cost perspective. Okay. Acetates, formates, glycols, and all the other non-chloride stuff. They're great at airports because they have almost zero corrosion to metal. And that's why people really like them at airports. And that's why some people use them on key infrastructure like bridges and things like that. They're not devoid of impacts to different pavement types, but that's kind of getting into the weeds. So we'll pass that down. But they do break down in the environment. When sodium chloride breaks down, it breaks down into a sodium and a chloride. And that chloride doesn't break down any further, and that's what we're talking about today. But when we're talking about acetates and formates, they break down into very basic elements like carbon and hydrogen. And so as they're broken down by microbes, those microbes are consuming oxygen, and that's called biological oxygen demand or biochemical oxygen demand. And so as these products hit the water, that BOD increases. And so what folks need to decide if they want to use these products is the potential impact from this elevated BOD, which can impact aquatic species, is it better than the impact you get from chloride loading to the environment? And that's kind of where we're at with de-icers right now. There hasn't been much growth. There is no silver bullet right now. There's no new technology on the horizon to fix this. Before I move on, even though it's not on this slide, we just recently wrapped up, maybe a year ago, a research project on the bio-based and ag-based products. And these are usually added to your chlorides. And so you would maybe add, 5% beet juice to your sodium chloride. And the benefit is there's actually corrosion protection when you use these products, which is really interesting. There's a benefit that we found. The sugars in them are not actually ice melters, but they do help prevent ice crystals from forming in a liquid matrix. So you get this delay in freezing when you have these bio-based products added. So it's a very subtle effect, but it is there. So as you hear people talking about beet juice or corn byproducts, there is a reason they're talking about them. And I think from a infrastructure point of view, the benefits to for corrosion protection are legitimate in terms of the cost of adding these products. Facility management, what I got from the talks earlier was that you guys do a really good job of storing all your product inside. The DOT in Montana also does a great job of storing their product inside, but at the local level, they don't have money to build sheds, and so they store their product outside. So, and as I drive around the country giving talks and going to conferences, I always look to see where they're storing their product, and I think it's a fair assessment that a lot of the local road agencies, they just don't have the funding or the structures to put the material in. But for me, facility management is one of the key initial starting points if you want to reduce your chloride loading to the environment. We spoke with Pennsylvania Turnpike, and they had some great input. They implemented across the board some good housekeeping practices. Their goals are just keep it clean, keep it organized, and keep it well maintained. It's much easier to maintain something than to start from the bottom and have to clean everything and get it all up to par. So they have a few things that they do. They call this the 10-foot rule in their buildings. They have 3-sided buildings with a roof, and they leave the bay door open, which you would think would be bad, but they place that bay door so that wind and weather don't come inside. But by setting the material back 10 feet, when weather does occur, it doesn't blow that material out. They don't get a lot of water going inside. So that's enough offset from the opening so that they don't lose their material. And then just another example of what they did was they just organized their trash so that when it is time for a pickup or to recycle it, it's all in one place and it's easy to clean up. So just pretty basic things that I think we all do at home, but we don't always necessarily do at work. Out in Montana, I guess out west, for us, we still have a problem with leaching of salt from maintenance facilities. And from my perspective from Montana, they are the single greatest potential point source of chloride loading to the environment. We have had lawsuits to the local counties and from the DOTs from piles that were not covered. They lost, and they had to pay to have new wells drilled. In one instance, they could not, and they had to relocate the family. That is a huge cost. So if you can say, we don't want $1 million lawsuit, we want a $50,000 barn, I think you can easily justify that from that perspective. But to prevent this, if you have solid material, you need to store it inside, and it needs to be on an impermeable surface, so asphalt or concrete. Just putting it on the dirt inside doesn't necessarily protect you. With liquids, they usually come in those big tanks. I had some pictures earlier. Some of the companies sell double-walled tanks, which is great. They're really hard to puncture unless you drive a forklift like straight into them. But where the tanks fail is where the fittings meet the tank. Either they crack or they freeze. And if you get a fitting that fails and you lose all your material, you're essentially putting that all in the environment. And unfortunately, in Washington, they had a tank fail and it flowed right down into a stream. So we're asking that people do secondary containment. That's a separate structure from the actual tank itself. You could go to a farm store and just get a big feed trough and plop that tank right in there and then fill it. Whatever capacity you can hold is great. We recommend 100% of the tank capacity, but do the best you can. Any material not put out there is better. Equipment calibration has come up as well, and this is really another good base starting point. It's really important to know how much you're putting out there, especially if you're going to invest in new technology and you want to show that it's saving you material in the long run. It's really important to train on how to calibrate and to keep records of who's calibrating and the equipment. I went to some manufacturing websites, and this is when they say you should calibrate, basically all the time. But the reality, except for New York DOT, and I was really excited to hear that, most folks, if you ask them how many times in a season did they calibrate, if anybody raises their hand, they say once a year. Once is better than nothing, but this is, if the manufacturers are telling you to calibrate this much and you're not calibrating at all, it's kind of a wake-up call. Awesome. So here's an example of someone that came to a workshop like this from a shed, a maintenance shed, and they said, oh man, we have never calibrated. Mark DeVries, who used to be a county roads guy, worked with these guys, and they said, okay, let's just go back to the shed after this. Let's just ask the guys to turn the dial and see just what's coming out of the back of the truck. And they were getting application rates of 500 to 1,200 pounds per lay mile. And these are just the settings that the guys just have always been doing. And so that's what they did. High-end application rates are recommended at 250 pounds per lane mile. So what they did is they calibrated their trucks. They set them at the lower rate of 250 pounds per lane mile. And just that one season, that one shed, saved $75,000. Now that's real money, but it's also less material and less effort. So in terms of like selling, putting less product out there, there's a ton of data, there's a ton of experiences. I think it's just sharing it. And if you're interested in learning how to calibrate, there is a wonderful tutorial on the Clear Roads website, and I'll show you how to get there. And it just walks you through every step of how to calibrate. Okay, so forecasting and data. I think the other piece of the puzzle for the non-winter maintenance professional, something that I get asked a lot is, well, what information do they use? They actually use a ton of information to make these choices about when to head out and why and what to use. This is just a general schematic of some data that's collected, but there's a network of sensors around the country, and they're called RWIS sensors, and they're collecting pavement condition data, weather data for the road specifically, that's used by the DOTs and by local road agencies. There are also private weather forecasters, the National Weather Service. They all work well, but a weather service forecast, they provide information for 30 feet above the road and higher. We need information on the road surface, and that's why this is so important. But if you go to your folks and you're asking why they're using a certain product, they're looking at humidity. They're looking at precipitation rate, type, and amount, even the water content of the snow, the air temperature, the pavement temperature, solar radiation, wind speed and direction, the pavement type and texture and condition. So it's a complex model that goes into this decision-making process. Okay, as I'm kind of winding down here, this is kind of off the topic, but to me it's a perfect example of winter maintenance operations that don't use any de-icers. So in the Great Plains, so eastern Montana, Wyoming, we get a lot of wind. I don't know if you guys have that, it seems pretty hilly here, but we get a lot of snow drifts on the road. And you can build a snow fence, and you build it such that you control where that drift forms, so it doesn't form on the road. They're very cost effective. They can be made out of wood. They can be made out of plastic. It could be a hedge that's in place. You can build a living snow fence. They take a little care, but you can build them. A great example of a snow fence program is in Iowa. They're working with the farmers along the highways, and they're buying 5 rows of corn back, and they're buying it at fair market value, and they keep them up all winter. They just let them stay. They don't harvest it. And that is their living snow fence. And the farmers love it because they're still getting money for it. Makes them look really good. And the people like to hear about it. Makes them feel like their tax money is going to good things. And it's been such a success that they've made big billboard signs that they put on the side of the road where these corn stalks are, just to let everybody know. So there's a lot of creative solutions you can come up with, using old technology. Okay, so really what I wanted to reiterate here is a lot of these are not necessarily new ideas. They're ideas that have maybe been around for 100 years or 5 years, but it's really encouraging people to try them and letting them run with them. So a big part of that is finding a project champion. That's what we call someone, and it can be a single person in an organization that goes to something like this and says, I want to calibrate our trucks. Let me try it. Let's just see what we're doing. And that one person can have a huge impact on the practice. I'd say every DOT that is progressive has had a project champion. A lot of them are in clear roads, and they take these ideas and they run with them, and they've become national standards, which is pretty cool. So one thing that has been touched on lightly, but that's road user expectations. And it's a really important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about how much de-icer is used. It's not fair for you to expect to drive 65 miles an hour in horrible weather conditions. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't want to slow down and they don't want to change their plans. But the reality is that if it's not safe for you to be out there, it's not safe for the plow driver to be out there. So I always add this in, whether it's a news article or a talk. It's that you as an individual need to have realistic expectations of what the road should be. And in that context, Minnesota DOT and Idaho DOT were concerned about how much product they were putting on the road, and part of that was driven by their level of service expectations that were the state guidelines. So they actually asked the people, what is your expectation of the road versus what are you comfortable driving on? And in Minnesota, they found that people are very comfortable driving with 2 snowy wheel paths on the road. And so they were able to lower their level of service expectation and put less product out on the road and put less money and effort into their winter maintenance operations. Idaho, it was more of a mixed bag, but going and actually talking to the people that you're serving and asking them what do they need and is that realistic can be a great conversation to have. And I guess my final point is really allowing and fostering a culture of change. And so, I think we've all worked with that one person that just, this is the way they do it and they don't want to change. But there's also usually that one person at the office that is gung-ho and they want to try new ideas, and let them, encourage them, and maybe even support them in that process. And so I'll kind of leave it at that. But the future is upon us. This is a real thing. Autonomous or self-driving snowplows are talked about every year in the winter maintenance, the National Winter Maintenance Committee, and they will be out and on the roads. It might be someone with a controller, like a drone, driving them, but they, in the near future, they could be out there. Caterpillar already has an entire mining facility that they run that way. The technology exists and it's out there. So that's where we're at.